All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Chris Jones. I'm with the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. This is our Garden and Country Extension webinar series. Today, I've got Elise Gornish with us. She's going to be talking about her research on the restoration approaches to manage buffelgrass and other invasives. Okay. A little bit about these webinars. They are a weekly Zoom webinar, 60 minutes or less, Thursdays at 11 Arizona time. They feature a variety of horticultural and natural resources topics relevant to environmental conditions and residential concerns in Gila County and beyond. There's a recording of this we posted at extension.arizona.edu/Gila, as well as all the other presentations we've had are recorded and up to date right now. University of Arizona is an equal opportunity affirmative action institution. Here's our agenda today. Thank you for those of you who have joined us a little early here and logging in. So our lag time. Here I am at 11 o'clock giving the welcome. I'm your moderator, Chris Jones. Presentation today is Restoration Approaches to Manage Buffelgrass and Other Invasives with Elise Gornish. When she finishes up, I may have some brief updates, but I'll provide an evaluation link. Really appreciate those of you who take some time to fill that out and give me ideas for more presentations. Just helps to keep this an effective program. We'll have our Q&A discussion with Elise at that time. Please feel free to put your questions into the chat box, and I'll be able to see your name in there, and then I'll be able to allow you to speak and promote you up so we can ask those questions. So be ready for that. And if you're not going to be able to unmute, just let me know, and that way I can ask the question for you. We may have some time for some open discussion, and we'll seek to wrap up by noon. Here is our presenter. Dr. Elise Gornish is a Cooperative Extension Specialist in Ecological Restoration at the University of Arizona. Those of you who came on a little early and heard us chatting, you can see she's very passionate about ecological restoration. So Elise, I'm gonna hand it over to you. Just turned off the share. Great. And you can bring up your slides, and it's all yours. Looks like it's good to go.
Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about restoration approaches to manage buffelgrass and other invasives. If buffelgrass isn't an issue for you where you live, lucky you, but this talk hopefully will still be relevant to you. So I'm a cooperative extension specialist in ecological restoration. So I focus my work on essentially looking at vegetation management in arid systems. And one of the things that I'm really interested in pursuing in terms of research and outreach is how can we use ecological restoration for weed management. I'm going to talk a lot today about sort of buffelgrass and couch my examples in buffelgrass, but I think that this approach can be employed for essentially any weed. So hopefully this is valuable to you even if buffelgrass isn't a problem for you. So hopefully you all just saw that my screen changed. Are we good with the screen change?
Good to go.
Great. Okay. So here we are in the beautiful Sonoran region. This is around where I live, which is a little south of maybe most of you. And we're pretty lucky because we do have a variety of native plants that call this area home. But unfortunately, there's a ton of invasive plants that are problematic, both in the southeastern region of Arizona, where I am, as well as the rest of Arizona. And you all are probably aware of sort of the big three, the three dominant ways that management approaches that people employ to get rid of invasive plants, okay? And so there's targeted grazing with cattle and other livestock, as you see on the left image. In the center image, there's herbicide, and on the right image is prescribed wildfire. And these are certainly very valuable and very useful tools in our toolbox to get rid of invasive plants. But there's this world of other tools that you can use that are both effective and can be particularly useful on smaller scales, which in terms of master gardeners is usually what we're thinking about, smaller scale approaches for weed management. And here's some examples. So here in the left image, you see plastic covering. So this is called solarization, where essentially you water an area with a lot of weeds, and then you cover it with this plastic cover. Once the plastic cover gets hit with sunlight, the weeds grow and then they burn, essentially, and then they fry. This second image, which I just had to use because it's really weird when you put mowing into Google Images and you get something like this, but mowing can be very effective for getting rid of invasive plants. The third image actually shows some bacteria. So there are actually a wide variety of beneficial bacteria, beneficial for natives, that actually if you inoculate into the soil, they're bad for invasive plants. And then this last image on the right is showing competition between plants. And this is actually what I'm going to focus on when I'm talking about using ecological restoration for weed management. And when I use the term ecological restoration, what I mean is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And this can be degraded, damaged, or destroyed from anything from a hurricane to putting in a parking lot to invasive plants. Okay, so why does restoration work for weeds, okay? And why does seeding or planting of native plants that were there before the weed came in, why is that effective against weeds? Well, native plants can both exclude existing weeds, so the weed problems that you have now, as well as prevent future weed invasions. So how does that work? Well, all plants are competing with one another for resources. Those resources are anything from space to light to nutrients. In our area in Arizona, where it's particularly dry, most of those competitive interactions are for limiting resources of water. And so when two plants are competing for a limiting resource like water, they're not going to do as well. They're not going to be as vigorous or maybe make as many seeds. And so when you have native plants competing for water, especially effectively with those weeds, they can actually outcompete them, and then the weeds die because they don't get enough water. Additionally, native plants can limit resource availability for future weeds. And so often what people do is they see a bunch of weeds in a field, they'll go out and they'll spray herbicide and that'll get rid of all the weeds. And they're like, great, we're done. And they walk away. What you've just done is left this huge open area that's ripe for reintroduction, because you've got all these open resources like space, like light, and all of the resources that are the moisture resources that are under the soil. And so the existing invasive or new invasive plants can come in and establish in that area. If you have native plants in that area, those native plants are already using those resources, and so they're not available to those future weeds. So that's how they can resist weed invasions. And I just want to give you an example of evidence that this actually works, okay? So I'm going to talk about a paper that was just published. It was led by Hannah Farrell, who is my PhD student, and she did almost all the work here. My name's on it, but she did everything. So everything good about this paper that you like, Hannah did. If there's any mistakes or anything you don't like, it's my fault, okay? And so Hannah was really interested in looking at all of the peer-reviewed literature, so all of the literature that's published by researchers who looked at treatments to reduce or remove buffelgrass, Pennisetum ciliare, okay? And this is a picture of what it looks like. So what she did is she went through all of the peer-reviewed literature, so that's all the papers that are published in fancy academic journals, as well as government reports and all kinds of other things that are not peer-reviewed but describe sort of effective strategies for control of buffelgrass. She found a total of 42 resources, so that's 42 individual papers, and a lot of times papers will describe multiple experiments or multiple studies. So that's why she was able to find 229 studies from these 42 sources. Just to give you an idea of kind of what the papers look like, so most of the papers, 70% of them were from the peer-reviewed literature. The rest were mostly government reports. Most of the studies were from the US, so buffelgrass, it's native to South Africa, but it's now in 17 countries, I think, and it's in a ton of United States states. It was actually brought here in the 40s by the USDA to address problems with the dust bowl. So it's a palatable plant for forage for livestock. They'll eat it, and it's super drought resistant. So it was seeded out so that ranchers could have something to feed their livestock, but unfortunately it is moved out of seeded zones and is now super bad for natives. So most of the studies we found, 71% of them, were from the US. The other studies were from Pakistan, India, Mexico, and Australia. Most of the studies were from the field, although 40% of the studies were from greenhouses where people were actually planting them in greenhouses to look to see how different control treatments worked. And of the field studies, 60% of those studies were from naturally invaded areas, while 40% of the studies were from pastures. So there are places both in the US and in Mexico where mostly ranchers are still actively planting buffelgrass so that their livestock have something to eat during drought. Okay, so the outcomes of this study are going to be shown on a graph that looks like this. So I'm going to show you a couple of graphs that look like this. And what this is showing is essentially the effectiveness of a range of treatments. So those are controls for buffelgrass. So on the left here, you see all the different types of controls we found. So there's at the bottom, just using wildfire by itself, using fertilizer by itself, using grazing by itself. And as you go up, you see interactive effects. So for example, the top one here shows the use of herbicide, and then later on, there's a follow-up of manual removal, so using your hands, okay? Excuse me. So again, here on the left, we have the different treatments we found for controlling buffelgrass. Now, you're gonna see a bunch of lines. If you see any lines on the left side of the blue dotted line here, that means that that treatment was effective in reducing the abundance of buffelgrass. If you see any lines on the right side, that means that that treatment actually, unintended, increased the amount of buffelgrass. We also looked at how those treatments might affect native species, and often this is an unintended consequence, right? Usually when you're employing something like fire, you just want to get rid of the buffelgrass, but you might unintentionally get rid of some natives. So you're going to see two different colored lines. You're going to see orange lines, and that's for buffelgrass, and then you're going to see gray lines for native species. Okay, so again, this is showing for each control treatment, which you see on the left, whether that treatment on average was able to reduce the abundance of both buffelgrass and natives, and those are everything on the left side of that blue line, or if they unintentionally increased abundance, and that's everything on the right side, okay? So first, just want to show you some general patterns that grazing by itself, the addition of fertilizer by itself, and fire by itself, both unintentionally increased eventually the amount of buffelgrass and decreased the amount of natives. So these were not good on average. We did find that herbicide alone was very effective at reducing the amount of buffelgrass. And so you see that the buffelgrass, the orange bars on the left side. It also reduced the amount of natives, as you see the gray bars also on the left side, and I'll get to that. You'll see now a bunch of numbers on the graph, and those are N values. So those are the number of studies that looked at that treatment. And I wanted to highlight this because herbicide, we found 130 different studies that looked at the effect of herbicide. So that was the dominant approach that people use for buffelgrass. And that's not surprising considering it looks like using herbicide really works for reducing buffelgrass. If you happen to be interested, these are the different herbicides that people do use for buffelgrass. Most of them are very effective at reducing the amount of buffelgrass, except for 3,6-DPA and 2,4-D that sometimes we found that using that herbicide actually results in the increase of buffelgrass. But this isn't what I'm focusing on today. I just wanted to show you that there's different types of herbicides that people use. What I really want to focus on is that herbicide, although it is really effective in reducing the amount of buffelgrass, it does also reduce natives. And what that means is that often when you use herbicide to get rid of buffelgrass, you're effective at reducing the amount of buffelgrass, but you're also getting rid of natives. And so what you're leaving is a fairly blank slate that is open and ripe for reinvasion. So maybe using herbicide alone isn't the most effective way to both get rid of buffelgrass and resist future invasives. What we found is that seeding alone, so this is just the seeding of native species without any other type of approach, on average, is fairly effective at reducing the amount of buffelgrass, as you see that yellow bar is on the left side, and unsurprisingly, increasing the amount of natives because you're seeding natives, right? So this is pretty good. What we also found is that when you use fire with additional treatments, and most of those additional treatments are restoration strategies, so that's either seeding or planting of native species, or herbicide with additional treatments, so that's mostly seeding or planting of native species or using ecological restoration. What you're able to do is both significantly reduce the amount of that invasive, of buffelgrass, and increase the amount of natives, okay? So what I hope this just showed is that there's evidence to suggest that using ecological restoration approaches, both alone as well as in tandem with other typical approaches, is very effective at both reducing the amount of existing buffelgrass as well as adding natives, which will provide resilience to future invasives. Okay, so I've hopefully convinced you that ecological restoration at least has some utility for weeds. So then what do you use, right? So this is a hard question. So my student, Hannah Farrell, also conducted another experiment where she was interested in looking at which species might be effective in reducing buffelgrass. And so she conducted a greenhouse study where she planted buffelgrass by itself, so one buffelgrass individual per pot, buffelgrass in competition with itself, so that's two buffelgrass individuals per pot, and then buffelgrass in competition with a bunch of natives that are typically used in restoration. So that's a buffelgrass individual in a pot and a native. And you can see here on the bottom of this graph all the different natives that we used. And what we did to look at sort of the effect on buffelgrass is we measured a variety of traits of buffelgrass. So here I'm showing, this is the root biomass you can see on the x-axis of buffelgrass when it's planted alone, by itself, and with a bunch of natives. And we looked at this both in drought systems, so you're gonna see a couple of dots that are orange, and in well-watered systems. You're gonna see a couple dots that are blue. And what we did actually is line everything up to alone. So essentially we measured the root biomass of buffelgrass alone, and then everything is scaled to buffelgrass root biomass alone. So this is showing how competition of either buffelgrass with itself or with other invasives, with other natives, modify root biomass of buffelgrass compared to when it's grown alone. So for example, when you grow buffelgrass with itself, so this is buffelgrass in competition with itself, in drought systems, this orange dot is pretty similar to what it is when it's grown alone. So there's not much difference in a drought environment when buffelgrass is grown with itself for its root biomass. However, in competition with itself, in a well-watered system, root biomass is significantly reduced, okay? So competition with other buffelgrass can significantly reduce the root biomass of buffelgrass when there's a lot of water. And we see almost the exact same thing for all of the natives. So when you plant natives in competition with buffelgrass, when you're trying to use natives for weed control for buffelgrass, in a drought condition, there are several species that will reduce root biomass compared to when buffelgrass is grown by itself. But all the species significantly reduce buffelgrass root biomass when it's well watered. Now, this is just for root biomass. We can look at a whole slew of other traits. For example, shoot biomass on the right. Now, shoot biomass is just how much biomass, how much stuff is above ground. And this is actually usually what most people think of when they're trying to assess sort of weed control effects, right? You spray or you burn or you graze, and then you look to see how much is actually growing above ground. And what we see is that there are a couple of species that, again, both in drought and in well-watered, are able to reduce the shoot biomass of buffelgrass. So suggesting that fluffgrass and tanglehead, Heteropogon contortus, are actually fairly good at reducing buffelgrass shoot biomass, both in conditions of drought, which is what we usually experience around here, as well as well-watered. So there's a lot going on in these two graphs, but I want you to get three things from these graphs, okay? The first is that, okay, it seems like there are some natives that might be effective in reducing the amount of root biomass or shoot biomass of buffelgrass. So there are some species that might be effective for controlling buffelgrass, but it's very species specific. So you can't just say, okay, throw some natives down and it'll work, okay? So species identity matters. It also matters what you're measuring, right? Because if you look at just root biomass, all of these native species were effective at reducing buffelgrass. But if you look at shoot biomass, only 2 of the species we looked at are effective. So species identity matters, and the thing that you're actually measuring to see if you're effective at reducing your invasive also matters. And finally, it's really important environmental conditions. We see big differences in the ability of native species to control buffelgrass when you have drought conditions, those are all the orange dots, versus well-watered conditions. So this is important because you might find something in a well-watered condition, and then you actually go and plant it, and then you have a terrible monsoon or late monsoon like we have now, and it's not working. And that's because environment matters, okay? So there's a lot of it depends of what to use for buffelgrass, and that's annoying, but that's the way ecology works, right? So instead of using species identity, which might not be too effective because you might not have tanglehead native to where you are, or you might not have fluffgrass native. So how is this useful? We also looked at species traits. So are there some traits of natives that are particularly useful in identifying candidates that might be good at restricting buffelgrass? So what we did is, in addition to looking at individual species, we measured a bunch of traits. So all the traits we looked at are on the x-axis of these graphs. So there's native grass initial height at the top. The next one is native grass shoot biomass, native grass root biomass, native grass leaf carbon, native grass leaf nitrogen. And we looked at how these traits might be useful at identifying candidates to restrict buffelgrass shoot biomass, okay? So that's on the y-axis across all of these graphs. And there's 2 lines on all of these graphs, okay? There is a single line, and that is drought conditions, and there's a dotted line in well-watered conditions. And so, for example, at this top graph, we see that the bigger the initial height of that native grass, the bigger the shoot biomass of buffelgrass, okay? And that's in both drought and well-watered conditions. Those are positive relationships. Those are upslope lines. So what that suggests is that in both drought and well-watered conditions, the bigger your initial height of your native plant, actually the bigger your buffelgrass is going to be. So initial height of your native plant is not a good indicator in either well-watered or drought conditions as a restoration candidate for weed control. But if you look at the next graph, we see that native grass shoot biomass in drought conditions, that's the single line, that's also a positive relationship with buffelgrass shoot biomass. So what that means is the bigger the shoot of your native, the bigger the shoot of your buffelgrass in drought conditions. Also not a good indicator. However, the line in well-watered is negative. There's a negative relationship. So this says that in well-watered conditions, the bigger the shoot of your native grass, the smaller your buffelgrass is going to be, okay? So this suggests that native grass shoot biomass is a good trait to use to pick your native as your competitor for buffelgrass if you're in a well-watered condition. So if you already know that the monsoon's really good, or maybe if you're in an irrigated pasture or in your backyard where you know you're watering a lot. We see the opposite for native grass root biomass. There's a flat line for well-watered, so there's no relationship between native grass root biomass and buffelgrass shoot biomass. But we see that there's a strong negative relationship for native grass root biomass and buffelgrass shoot biomass in drought conditions. So this says in drought conditions, the bigger the native grass root biomass, the smaller your buffelgrass is going to be, okay? So what we're seeing again is that traits can be very useful in identifying candidates to use for weed control, but it depends on what trait you look at and environmental conditions. okay? So really the management implications are what I just said. Restoration can be an effective component of a weed control program. So the review that I showed you at the beginning of the talk hopefully supported and showed you evidence that indeed restoration either alone or particularly in tandem with other invasive plant management like herbicide or fire can be really effective in both reducing the amount of your invasive and increasing the amount of natives, which provides resilience for future weed invasion. Additionally, for buffelgrass specifically, and I think that this is probably operates for other invasive plants, that the species you use will depend on your environmental conditions and it will depend on what you're looking at. Usually we look at shoot biomass when we're assessing whether weed control is effective, but you might be looking at root biomass. You might be looking at flower production. You might be looking at leaf nitrogen. There's a lot of things you can look at. What we found is that in a dry year, plant species with really big root structures, so the species that are able to take up the small amounts of moisture that are actually in the ground, are the best for providing resistance to buffelgrass. But in a wet year, you don't need those big root systems because there's plenty of water. So what you're actually fighting for is space and light. And if you're fighting for space and light, what you want is a lot of above ground shoot biomass. And we also found that high leaf nitrogen is also effective, but most people aren't going to measure leaf nitrogen. So usually we just suggest that if it's a wet year, or if you're in an irrigated pasture, or if you're in an area that you know receives a lot of water, you want to choose natives that have high above ground biomass. And that's it. And so I hope I convince you that ecological restoration approaches can be effective by themselves or particularly in tandem with other weed management strategies, both to get rid of your existing weeds as well as to resist future weeds. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Elise. Okay, so anybody who's got questions, please put them into the chat box. And I've got something from Hillary to start with. So Hillary, I'm going to allow you to talk. So you can unmute yourself and ask your question about a bunch of weeds here.
Yes. Hello, I have an open space of land, new yard, and on it we have goat's head, the tribulus, and then we have Malva sylvestris, cheeseweed, and Cynodon dactylon, the Bermuda grass. And I'm wondering if these methods, we've already seeded a lot of natives, but it's a dry year, it's going to be difficult. And so I'm wondering if this concept has any effect on the weeds that I've just named.
Thanks for the question, Hillary. So you've got some of our favorites.
Yes.
So actually, I can, for goat head specifically, I have a paper I can send you that actually suggests that restoration can be very useful. But I think in general, often invasive plants are dominant because they're able to take up a limiting resource faster and to a higher magnitude than natives. And so if you can get that resource away from the invasives using natives, that invasive is not going to be able to persist. So I think for all species, this idea can be useful. The challenge is that for a lot of the species you mentioned, particularly the Bermuda grass, species provide strong competition only after they're established. And for a lot of our species, particularly our native perennial bunch grasses in Arizona, it takes 3 to 5 years for the species to establish. And so I think that these approaches can be useful when used in tandem with other approaches, especially if you have like sort of a long look at it, right? Yeah. How you're probably going to have to spot spray and hand pull, which I know for Bermuda grass particularly is not fun. It's for cheeseweed as well. But, you know, and getting your natives down and then helping them to get to the point where they're established so that they can actually put some competitive pressure on the invasive is critical. You know, a native tanglehead seedling that's this big is not going to have any competitive pressure on anything. But once that tanglehead gets big and established, it's going to stay there. It's really hard to get rid of that tanglehead, right? And so how do you get that tanglehead to a point where it's actually putting in that competitive pressure? And that's doing all kinds of other approaches like spot spraying and hand pulling and things like that.
Yes, we've done that.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
good luck. It's difficult.
Yes, thanks very much.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Hillary. The next question we have is from Steve, and he asks, if left alone, why is buffelgrass a problem? And
Yes.
I had another question if we had a picture for buffelgrass. So
Oh, yeah. Do you want me to show my...
While you're answering that, I can find one online and share.
Okay, great. Yeah, Steve, so buffelgrass does the things we planted it here for. It's super resilient to drought, and it's got fairly good forage for livestock. Unfortunately, it grows in monocultures extremely quickly. It's apomictic, which means that it can self, and so it doesn't need pollinators. It doesn't need pollen blowing. So it grows really fast. It produces thousands of seeds per individual. It takes out our natives, and it enhances fire to a frequency and an intensity that our natives can't take. So not only does it resist our natives from growing, but of the natives that are around, buffelgrass provides tons of fuel for wildfire, and those wildfires can kill even our established saguaros. And so it's super problematic. And I think Chris might show a picture of it.
Yeah, let me see if I can get to my screen here. And so if you just Google up buffelgrass, it'll come up.
There's not many things that it looks like. It's hard to, it has a congener, which is, I'm forgetting what, but there's a grass called fountain grass that's much more commonly found in urban areas. It's actually planted, because people think it's pretty. It's got these really fluffy purple tops. And so usually out in wildlands, it looks like a lot of other stuff. I would never suggest that people who aren't sure to pull it if they don't know. But yeah, you can, I mean, we've found individual plants that have like over 300 culms, so that's individual stems, and every 3 stems can make 100 seeds. So we're talking about, 30,000 seeds per plant. It's crazy.
And if I could just add, as Elise was pointing out in this image here, it's in the same genus or very closely related to fountain grass. And so it has that, kind of distinct seed head. But I guess others could be like it, but I mean, this is what it looks like. And I was just picking some of those other images that just show how it can spread across the desert. So hopefully that helped out with that.
It's also usually the first green thing that you see out in wildlands, even before the rain. It can get green before everything else.
It's a summer grass rather than a winter grass, and but it's a perennial. So they got a lot of good strategies for hanging out there.
Yeah.
Okay, let me get on to our next question here. And I did share the evaluation survey with you all there. I'm going to put up a poll in just a little bit to I've got somebody who helps me promote this and just find out where you heard about this presentation. And so the next question was from Richard. Let me get Richard up here. And so if you can want to open your mic, or I can ask this question for you. All right.
Ooh, this is
I'll get in. Hi, Elise.
Hi, Richard.
So I used to manage rangelands up in the Tonto National Forest, up where Chris is there.
Mm-hmm.
And we spent a lot of time and money removing the buffelgrass
Mm-hmm.
for the most part. But my question is, in the cases of this climate change that we're in, where our native grasses may be migrating to a more desirable condition somewhere, and buffelgrass is coming on their heels. Is it best to have something there, anything there, to protect my soil and allow then the buffelgrass to get set up? Or should I continue spending time and money removing the buffelgrass if I don't have a native grass to go back in there?
Yeah, that's a $1 million question. So I would say if you don't have something to get down on the ground, so let me back up before I say that. We found in our review that in general, the native seed bank is not enough to replenish and to repopulate areas when you either pull buffelgrass or spray. And so that's why we suggest you should seed. I know that there are managers in Tucson particularly who disagree with us, and they have worked in their areas and they've pulled buffelgrass out and maybe spot sprayed, but they have not reseeded, and they say that the native seed bank is enough to replenish and it actually grows back. And so my suggestion to you, what I'm going to say is in opposition with what other people have found. So if you think that your native seed bank is depleted, or you notice that when you pull out buffelgrass, essentially nothing else grows back, I would say that you should not get rid of buffelgrass if you've got nothing else to put down. I would say that for any invasives, because essentially if you get rid of something and then you have a blank slate, bare soil, all you're going to do is lose topsoil, which we've already lost most of it, and you're very likely to get reinvasion by buffelgrass because the seeds are going to be there, and by other things that are coming in. And so the question is then, if you can find things either to seed or to really to plant, because I think for the most part seeding is really difficult to get large areas successfully reseeded here. But if you can replant even small areas, so kind of getting pockets of these, they're called islands of fertility, but getting small pockets established where you really baby along, maybe even water or hand pull, and you get these pockets established. And then those little pockets can resist buffelgrass, and then you start growing those pockets. I think that that's the most effective way to do this. But you got to find species. You know, a lot of us have been using a lot of sort of workhorse restoration species for a long time, the same species that we know do really well in terms of germination and establishment. But these are species that might have been native to environmental conditions like 30 years ago, and it's starting to get drier and warmer. And so being a little more strategic with finding species that are a little more tolerant of these conditions, of new conditions, really has to be the way that we think about this. And I know people that are starting to plant succulents in areas because they're a little more drought tolerant than some of our native grasses, and there's a lot of back and forth about that, and we don't need to get there now. But I think sort of focusing efforts on reintroducing natives that are particularly drought resilient in small pockets in these invaded habitats can be the way that you actually can grow out resilient sort of islands of natives for your buffelgrass.
Great, thank you.
Great. Okay, I've got some more questions come up here. I want to throw up this poll I just mentioned, so people can spend a little time answering where you heard about this. Basically, I sent out a big email blast and want to know if you're on that listserv. Someone forwarded it to you. Got a colleague sending out some newspaper articles for me, and Facebook. And then if you got other, the poll doesn't give me a chance on how you can tell me what other is, but that'd be great if you could.
It's something else.
So do I have to hit launch? Oh, maybe I do have to hit launch. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so now it's open. So while we're working on that, I'm going to bring up Michael Chamberlain. I got 2 questions in the Q&A. And the great thing is Elise, the person who asked the question after Michael, let me get you up here, Mike, first. So he's asking how to establish native plant competitors across a weed-infested landscape. But then Kathleen McCoy asked, Stinknet seems to be spreading south and north. Do we have any information about natives' ability to compete with it? I know Michael's been doing a lot on Stinknet, so I just want to put that out there because I think we have a good little conversation on that.
Yeah, so Michael would definitely be the one to answer Stinknet. I think Stinknet is so new. I mean, we have an understanding now of some herbicides that seem to be effective against it, but I don't think anyone's checked kind of in terms of natives. Michael would know more than me for sure. And what was the first question?
Just,
I've already.
yeah, Michael, you're up.
Okay, Michael, you're up.
Hi, Elise.
Hey.
Hey, yeah, so about Stinknet, it really does seem to be competitive with a lot of the winter annuals. One plant that does, I'm just speculating, might have potential is Brittle Bush in Celia farinosa. And so I might ask you about what do you think of that? Could that be deployed as a competitor against Stinknet?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a bunch of shrubs that in general, like desert broom, things like that, and brittle bush is one of them, that, or shrub-like species that seem to be just like the things that show up in moonscapes. A lot of people don't like them for this reason, because sometimes you end up getting this sort of monoculture of desert broom or brittle bush or whatever. But I would say if you can get a native established, and that seems to be your only native, that is a better place to work from, sort of a monoculture of this shrub, this native shrub, and then working to try to use facilitation, or, excuse me, taking out some of the shrubs and seeding in native forbs or something else. That is a better place to start from than just you have this world of Stinknet and you want a diversity of species immediately. You might have to work up to that. And I'm sure Carrie Ann has some great things to say about that too. Carrie Ann Campbell knows everything about getting native species established.
Well, before I go to Carrie Ann here, just want to say thank you for everybody who responded to the poll. 35% got an email from me. 50% got it forwarded. So at least people were sharing this with them.
Great.
My local, the interest, the newspaper and Facebook, not so much. And then 25% were others. So thank you so much for taking the time to share that information with us. So Carrie Ann, you've got a question. So I've got you promoted. Go ahead.
All right. Hi, Elise.
Hi.
And hi, Michael, too. I love the idea of Brittle Bush as a competitor for Stinknet, by the way. I think that would be a really promising choice. So my question is about species choice in terms of competing with buffelgrass after you've done your other treatment. And I really like this idea of thinking about drought conditions versus wet conditions. But as you know, in a lot of restoration situations, we don't have that knowledge to know what is it going to be like. So I'm wondering about your thoughts in terms of when devising a seed mix post restoration. I mean, to me, it still seems like it makes sense to have a diverse seed mix to hedge your bets against whatever nature is going to bring you in terms of the weather, but maybe thinking about balancing it between these different species that will behave differently versus whether it's wet or dry.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. Diversity is always best. Ecology loves diversity. Having a diversity of both drought tolerant as well as sort of species that like a lot of rain is a great idea, always. And what you can also think of, I think, from the next level is thinking, okay, if we don't know what kind of situation we're going to be in, and we have this good diverse mix of both super drought tolerant as well as species that do well and well watered, maybe the next thing to think of is what species will stay viable in the seed bank longer, right? Because if we go through several years of drought, it would be kind of a bummer to spend a lot of money on these really beautiful but expensive forbs that like 1 year in the seed bank and they're done. But if they can hang out and persist and stay viable through those years of drought, and then there's this deluge, it'd be great if you know that those species, then they're going to pop up.
Cool. A follow up, just because I've gotcha. I know the study really focused on grasses and their competitive abilities with the buffelgrass, but do you have any inkling about different shrub species as well? Or is that kind of like the next frontier?
Yeah, that's the next frontier. So we use grasses because typically ecological theory suggests that the more functionally similar you are to your competitor, the stronger you're going to compete in general, which is just why we pick grasses, but certainly functionally dissimilar. So shrub versus grass, forb versus shrub, whatever. There's competition. I think shrubs are awesome. Usually I've done work in mine sites where like, it's this crazy mine, there's nothing growing except desert broom and there's brittle bush and like nothing else. And you're like, okay, well, these guys are doing well. And they're fairly fast growing. So I think considering shrubs is a great idea, especially when we talk about diversity. By the way, everyone, my child is coming back in the house, so I'm probably gonna have to mute in a minute. But when we think about diversity, it's not just diversity of sort of dry versus wet, but diversity of flowering types, of when things germinate, of functional types, all this stuff.
Well, I love it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming, Carrie-Ann.
Okay, so we've got the chat box and Q&A open, so please put your message in there and we can respond to it. I did put the, let me bring that chat box up here. I did put that evaluation link in, so I'll go ahead and put it in one more time so you can spend a little time and respond to it if you could, please. Hey, your camera's looking good there. Who's this, Elise?
This is my daughter. This is Vega. She's really into plants.
Awesome.
She also really likes attention, so there might be some yelling. We'll see.
No. When you were talking with Rick about islands of, when you're saying trying to put as the
Islands of fertility.
islands of fertility, and so you'd be looking for places with the soil and moisture and opportunities that something to be able to get established there. I'm thinking, you know, wildlife stock tanks. Without, I mean, just what types of thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, so the idea of islands of fertility is really sort of this idea from restoration that's, if you have a whole area that's degraded, whether it's degraded from drought or weeds or whatever, instead of attempting to restore this entire area, you identify locations that you're most likely to be successful. And this can be anything from areas that have a little bit more moisture. So this can be small dips, toe sites of hills, areas under existing giant trees. And then you choose those areas as your island of fertility. So the fertility is, you have a little more of that resource, right? And then you seed or plant in those areas and baby them along. And what you get is, instead of attempting to restore a 300-acre field, you identify maybe 10 by 10 meter plots, essentially, where you put a lot more sort of effort, invest more effort into hand weeding and planting and maybe even watering. And you get those smaller areas developed and established, and then they start growing out like bullseyes, because the plants, once they're established and they make seed, they'll start dispersing outside of the island of fertility. And so you get these areas established. They're a stronghold of natives and also a source of a propagation, propagule source of seed. And so not only do they exist to enhance native plants sort of outside, but they also resist invasion into the island of fertility. And for anyone that's interested, there's a 60-second vegetation management video about this that you can find on my website.
Well, I'll try to, maybe I can get a post. And are those typically excluded? Are you able to create those and be able to have things move around them?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's actually a big debate about keeping animals out of Here, why don't you play with this? There's a big question about about grazing animals and ecological restoration, because some people think that you just can't get anything established if you have animals moving around and walking. I would say if you have an area that's excluded from livestock, those can often be good areas where you're going to get more success. However, there's lots of places where you can't exclude animals. And I think that sort of shifting our thinking of, there's ways that restoration and working landscapes can sort of work together is an effective way to start thinking about this. And so we can do restoration on areas where there are animals. And there's actually some studies that show that animal movement is really good for germination, because there's nutrient deposition from the pee and the poop, but there's also sort of the enhancing seed to soil contact by the hoof action And so I think it's way more gray than black and white.
Yeah.
But if there's a choice, often exclusion is good, especially if you're planting in plugs that are pretty sensitive to being walked on or eaten.
Okay, Hillary, I've got you up next here.
Yes, hello, Elise again.
Hi, Hillary.
My question here is, have there been any studies, do you know anything about a lilopathy amongst the native grasses and their competitiveness with buffelgrass, Bermuda grass, any of the other grasses here?
That's an awesome question. So you don't want this out? So there's a whole world of study of that exactly, and not just a lilopathy in the sense of sort of these fungi or bacteria that are actually bad for the invasive, but then there are also bacteria and fungi that are really good for natives that just enable them to establish at much faster rates and more robustly. I'm less sure about the natives around here. I could certainly look for you, and there's maybe Michael or even Carrie Ann know more about that than I do, but I do know in California, there are definitely sort of these microbial communities, so bacteria and fungi that live near the roots of natives that the natives need in order to establish. So it's less of a sort of antagonistic towards invasives, but there's this need for these communities for your
Mycorrhizae?
Yes, yeah, mycorrhizae, there's also bacteria. And so if you don't have this stuff in the soil, and often these communities are depleted in the presence of these invasives, then you can plant this robust plug of a native in, and it's going to die because it doesn't have sort of the communities it needs.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so still have some time here for any questions.
I just want to note there was a note earlier from Barry that he said the red font type on green background is really hard to read, and I apologize for that. I will definitely modify that for future presentations. Thanks for that note. And if we don't get some more questions, we can always shut this down a little early. I mean, that's not a problem at all. And you can see that Vega's come in and she's ready to go. Playing with some Play-Doh.
So I'm going to bring up my closing screens. And here's Elise again. And just wanted to say thank you. I put the link for this webinar evaluation into the chat box. So taking the time to fill that out for me helps me a lot with my program. I see some new Q&A up here, perhaps. No? Anyway, okay, excuse me. And here is our closing slide. The next webinar will be on Thursday, August 13th at 11 a.m. as usual. I've got Jan Groth, who's the Master Gardener Program Coordinator down in Cochise County for our Cooperative Extension Program down there. And she's going to be giving a talk on container gardening. Last week or 2 weeks ago, I had Bill Cook give a presentation on container gardening. It was very popular. She and Bill have given this talk together. And so she came back and said, I've got more to follow up on that. And so we'll have a lot of fun. And we'll get this presentation up on at my county website. I call Garden and Country. And at least we may have I can always include some videos or web links that along with that. So I've been setting that up for extra resources.
Great. And if anyone after this has any questions, there's only one Elise Gornish on her. If you could just Google my name and get my email.
So I want to thank everybody for their time today. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and just thank you everybody and see you all next week.